Nation. Welcome back for another evening of Radio Architecture with Ilana Razbash live on Radio Karam. As always, if you'd like to join the conversation, please text us in the studio on 0493 213 831. We'd love to have you with us and would love to have you part of the conversation as well. My guest this evening and conversation partner is Shareen Joel, the founder and principal of Melbourne-based multidisciplinary design practice, Shareen Joel, specialising in industrial design, interior architecture, and architectural building design. Established in 2003, the studio is renowned for its commitment to authentic timelessness. Under Shareen's direction, the practice excels in creative direction across interior and architectural design, product design, furniture design, and brand management. Shareen Joel has crafted distinct identities for leading retail and commercial clients, including Witchery Country Road, Seed, Sheridan, Sea Folly, Beckton, Clipsal, Lockwood, Freedom Furniture, Zip Industries, and Oraton, as well as a growing number of residential projects. Each project is explorative while remaining steeped in longevity and with an affinity for honest materials, classical proportions, exquisite craftsmanship, and fine detailing that underpins the Shareen Joel design ethos. Throughout her career, Shareen has staked her reputation on the simple, timeless, balanced, and elegant aesthetic that now precedes her. With over 30 years of experience, Shareen began her career in 1991 as an industrial interior and automotive designer working for Ford Motor Company in Australia, the UK, and Germany, and in the USA. Her role took her to the international fashion shows, furniture fairs, international design events, and to leading international audio shows, confirming for her eye for detail and materiality early on. Welcome to the program, Shareen. I'm so glad to have you with me.
Thank you, Ilana. Wow, makes me sound quite old. When I listen to that, I think about, it just sort of takes me back to so many years of my career. But I actually feel like it was all yesterday, to be honest with you. One of my first projects was with Ford, as you mentioned, and it was really weird. This week, possibly on Monday night, my son-in-law sent me through Instagram a message from the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles, and it was of a car which I designed, but I actually almost forgot that I designed it. It was a GT90, and I've never really remembered the process until I saw that Instagram post, and it brought back so many memories. So I had to write on it, where is that car? I designed it, and I've had incredible feedback for the last 4 days on Instagram, because it's just all these memories that come flooding back, and then you make, thankfully, because of social media, you make connections again. And so a lot of the designers that were on the design team have seen my comment, and they've written to me as well. So
what an amazing story and timely week for this conversation.
It sure is, because, you know, you think about all the cars, and people always ask me, what car did I design? And I always think the most obvious ones, which are the Mustang, the Ford car, the Ford Ranger, the ones that are in production, but you forget about the concept cars. And the GT90 was probably one of my most memorable. However, I never really have thought about it because it's been so many years.
What made it so memorable?
It was a period which we termed New Age design, and it was a revolution in terms of design, because until then all the cars, particularly American cars, were going through a very bulbous stage, and they looked very bloated and rounded. And so we had this concept called New Age design, which sounds very 90s. But if you look at that GT90 today, which is on the Peterson Museum Instagram page, you'll see that it's quite contemporary. Like, it could be in production today. So I think that's what was most memorable about it. It's actually a really sexy car, and it was then and it still is now.
Did you always love cars?
Well, I loved cars. I never thought that I'd be a car designer. It happened because I grew up obviously loving architecture and design. My mum was in the fashion industry. My dad was in manufacturing. And my grandparents were tailors. And when they arrived in Australia, my grandparents, they had a business manufacturing duffel coats and pea coats, which they sold to Myer and David Jones and Country Road. And then my dad got into manufacturing. So I was always exposed to design and manufacture. And I knew that was something that I really enjoyed and really loved. So then when I was at school and I went around to all of the universities to have a look at the open days, I had my heart set on doing fashion design or graphic design. I'd never heard of industrial design. I thought it was designing factories, which is what most people have thought industrial design is up until recently. So I saw industrial design and I thought this is the perfect blend of everything I'm interested in, because with industrial design you can do absolutely anything with it.
Absolutely. Automotive objects, anything in the home.
Furniture, appliances.
Packaging.
Exactly. So I was always very entrepreneurial and self-motivated. And because I love design so much and was so passionate about it, I never wasted holidays not doing work experience. I did work experience with BTR Nylex, which produced hoses and vinyls and all different materials. I did work experience with designers like Mark Douglas, who was a glass blower and a welder. And I did lots of work experience with lots of different manufacturing companies. So I knew more or less that I would be okay. I'd find a job. And while I was at university, while I was doing work with BTR Nylex, all of the automotive suppliers used to come in because BTR was a supplier.
I was just wondering, how did that automotive come up for you?
And then I was studying industrial design. I was probably one of the first females through industrial design at the time. It was only at RMIT. It wasn't at any other university. And all the automotive companies, Toyota, General Motors, Mitsubishi and Nissan and Ford, all came and offered me a job at RMIT. And so I was in a very fortunate position because in 1990 there was a huge recession and there were no jobs going. But I think I was uniquely placed because I had so many interests that I could have gone into any area.
Absolutely. What's your biggest advice for students and graduates who might be on that precipice right now?
I think that to keep options open, I think it's really important to not feel entitled and not feel too comfortable, that you should always, and I've always encouraged my own children, that you should always look for a job, particularly when you're at university, unpaid, and develop your skills. And wise words that my mentor, which was Max Beck, who owned Beckton at the time, he said to me when I was offered the job at Ford, and to go to Ford in the UK was my first overseas stint, and I was only 21 at the time. I ended up living overseas for almost 10 years. And he said, you're never too old to do your apprenticeship, and you should always do your apprenticeship. And that's what I say to all younger students, people that are interested in doing design. I say you've got to do your apprenticeship. You have to learn to do everything. If you're interested in building, then you need to learn how to weld. You need to learn how to do foundry, you know.
So really come to your trade, to your craft with a holistic background and a holistic appreciation of what's involved.
And never think that you're that you can just sit at a computer and do everything on a computer. You have to get out there and you have to work really hard.
How was that coming into the motor automotive industry.
Oh,
That's quite, in my mind, quite industrial, quite heavy machinery.
well, it was. And particularly, I was working out in Campbellfield. That was my first stint, very male dominated. And, I could say more stories than you hear now today. But I stood up for myself and I believed that the best person for the job, always, and respecting superiors, and that I really appreciated learning and people that were experienced and had interesting content. And for me, I was in a really fortunate position. I'll never take that for granted. I was lucky with the position I got, but I also worked really hard, and it wasn't easy all the time. I had to learn a lot of big lessons, particularly manufacturing a car. There are a few that are very memorable, but I appreciated every moment of it.
What was the biggest challenge? What was one of those lessons?
Well, because I was responsible for signing off on things, you can sign off and make big mistakes.
And dangerous mistakes.
Just
like architecture.
Yeah. And it's not one house, it's not one room, it's not one chair, it's thousands of cars coming off a production line. And so when you sign off on the wrong finish or the wrong colour or the wrong style and you approve it, it comes out for years, and you always have to look at it and think, how did I sign off on that? And there were occasions but I learnt pretty quickly that you have such an impact and that you really need to double check and triple check and don't make those same mistakes again.
Very important lessons. I think very important lessons for all our listeners tonight. So many good takeaways there. And that you can make mistakes, that everyone makes mistakes.
Exactly.
That's actually part of the process of learning, right? If you don't make mistakes, you don't learn.
100%. And I've always had staff working for me, and they've felt so bad when there has been an error and it's gone into manufacture or installed. And I always say to them, oh no, you don't know what a mistake is until you've got 1,000 cars coming off a production line.
In the wrong colour.
In the wrong colour or the wrong finish or the wrong design, then you know that you've made a mistake. I say a one-off you can fix, you can rectify that. That's very different. So, yeah, everybody makes mistakes, and that's part of learning. And you have to accept those mistakes and take accountability and responsibility for them and learn from it.
People still bought those cars though.
They did. And to this day, I still, if I see one, like I saw one in Milan this year, I still look and I still think, oh my gosh.
Talk about a haunting.
It haunts me. It will haunt me forever. But
let's pivot to architecture a bit.
Yes.
I want to ask the question I like to ask all my guests, and that's, what's your earliest memory of a building or place?
I think there are probably two, but the most memorable would be probably my grandmother's house, because when they arrived in Australia, probably in the 60s, they built it, and it was all designed. They had a furniture maker, an Austrian furniture maker called Zuruf, who was very well known, and he designed every bit of and handcrafted every bit of joinery, chairs, screens, partitions, the entire house.
Stunning.
So it's really memorable in terms of the style as well of the architecture. It's probably not standing today, but I think that's probably my earliest memory. My grandmother must have been very much into, we didn't really talk about it, but she must have been very much into design and architecture because the house was very holistic.
What was it like on the inside?
The carpet was custom made. I think it was like almost like a sage colour, and it had a pattern sort of etched into it. And then all the timber was blackwood, which was a very common Australian timber to be used. And it was used on the sides of the armchairs. It was used on the screens that concertinaed. It was used everywhere. So it was very 60s, the house and the furniture and the carpet. So it just had that very holistic design that you would associate with 60s architecture and design.
Do you know if they had an architect or this was a renovation?
No, it was an architect. I'm not sure who the architect was, but it was definitely an architect that did it.
Incredible. How did that pivot out of the automotive industry, or towards a more expansive industrial design occur for you?
So for me, actually, when I was studying, I really wanted to work in Italy, in Milan, as a furniture designer. I still do. When I come back in my next life, I absolutely loved furniture design always. So when I was working for Ford in Detroit, I studied interior design as well.
At the same time?
While I was working, yeah.
While you're working. Keep them busy.
Yeah. So I've always studied and done other degrees, tried to do other degrees or other courses. So I did interior design, and because I loved furniture. And I also was aware that if I returned to Australia, the automotive industry was not going to be around forever, which was very sad at the time, but it was a reality. And so I always learnt graphic design or interior design, and then I started to design my own products. So when I returned to Australia after Detroit, I then started working with, I consulted to Ford as they were finishing up design in Australia. And then I started to pivot into product design. So I came back and I approached brands in Australia, and I approached developers, and yeah, that's how I pivoted into product design, I suppose, back into designing for Clipsal and for Lockwood.
What was your first piece?
When I first came back, I designed for Lockwood a range of door levers. And the reason I did that was that I was working on commercial projects and we wanted door levers that would match. And so I contacted them, and then I also had the idea for light switches and power points, GPOs, with Clipsal. And yeah, that's how it kind of evolved. And then from there, a lot of retailers reached out to me and asked if I'd help with retail store design. And it all evolved. It all became one. It's actually quite a blur for me because the interiors and the product, the ranges, it all became one. Like I designed ranges for the retailers. I designed the retail store that went with the range. So it all sort of came together. And I suppose that's how my practice has evolved.
It's fantastic to hear how holistic design is for you and how holistic design thinking is, because that's the essence of it, isn't it? Once a designer, always a designer.
Yes.
can take those skills across all those fields. But it's also very much Bauhaus school of thought that architecture and interiors is the sort of the mother of all design, but all these disciplines are holistically part of the training, and that hunger for learning is very much under that Bauhaus model of study.
Yes, definitely. And also, I mean, even, when I think about it, and we just returned from Los Angeles a few weeks ago, where I was very fortunate to go and see the Eames House. And I think another inspiration for me when I was living in Detroit was I went to Eames, lived and worked in Detroit. They worked with Herman Miller and Knoll. And I worked a lot with those factories and manufacturers for show cars We needed the Aeron chair, which was designed by Herman Miller to be used in a concept car. And then there was Cranbrook Institute of Design in Michigan. And so I went there, and that's where Ray and Charles Eames, they lived in-house, and they were head of design and architecture at Cranbrook.
I didn't know they lived in a house.
Yes,
Wow.
in Cranbrook House there. And so I also spent a lot of weekends when I wasn't at Ford going and looking at all the houses, case study houses, the houses by the Eameses that they did in California, the houses by Frank Lloyd Wright that he designed Falling Water in Pennsylvania, and he also designed in Pasadena while I was lecturing at Art Centre in Pasadena in design. I saw those houses, and I saw that those architects, the Eameses, Ray and Charles Eames, and Frank Lloyd Wright, they designed architecture and product and furniture. They designed everything. And so that was probably my first wake-up call when I was living in Detroit, when I realised that these masters of architecture in America and also Le Corbusier and Eileen Gray in Europe, that they were not only designing architecture and the interior, they were designing all the furniture and all the product. So I knew that when I came back to Australia, that was how I had to have a point of difference.
You'd found your place, or your constellation of peers in a way.
Yes.
Designed down to the last doorknob.
Right.
Have you done it, other than the Lockwood suite, have you done a doorknob for a house as well?
Well, for a lot of the projects I do, we custom design
All the hardware?
all the hardware as much as we can. We try to design the hardware. We try to design as many fittings as we possibly can. And I suppose that's what I really love about what I'm doing now. I really like the opportunity that it presents, that I can do everything from the architecture to the interior to the furniture and the products, because that's what I love. I really love doing that.
That must be so amazing to be able to offer something so holistic.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an advantage of being an industrial designer, because I understand how things are made, how things work. I really like to get back to the essence of a material, and that the material drives the design. And when it comes to, for example, door hardware, you mentioned that as an example, that is all, it comes down to the material and not wasting material. So we did a stainless steel range where it was machined, but not machined in a way that there's waste. I try not to have waste in materials. I try to be able to reutilise it in another area. So that's what the beauty is about working on a whole house or a whole design.
You describe across your social media something called the classic Shareen Joel aperture.
Yes.
What do you mean by that? Take us in.
So for me, natural light is really important. And no matter the orientation of a house, I think that there's a way of always bringing in design through the light. And whether it be the reflection against a wall from a skylight, or whether it's an opening in a window, I always try to imagine what the light is going to do at different times of the day and how it's going to change the design, change the room, and change the atmosphere. So for me, the aperture is more than just an opening. It's also about the space it creates.
It's not just the view, it's not just the framing of that one picture window, it's really the experience overall. This reminds me so much, and it's so important to actually say you can always work hard to get light in. Reminds me of in London, the best museum in London, in my opinion, Sir John Soane's House Museum, with only one street aspect, so many levels, and the most phenomenal experience and experiments on natural light.
Yes.
With tricks and mirrors.
Beautiful. Exactly. And you you can take a building that's orientated in the wrong direction for today, because obviously in the sort of last century, people weren't as focused on natural light and gaining northern light. A lot of houses were south orientated. So you can take a house or a product that's got the wrong orientation, but by being smart with aperture, you can give that same light that you want forever, I suppose.
The same experience. And also
Yeah.
considering how it moves and changes throughout the day. When you're getting a bespoke product in a bespoke home, and your lifestyle, say I'm only in that room in the evenings, so commonly those rooms, those sitting rooms, will only be designed for the experience in the evening, for the sunset, for the post-dinner relaxation.
So the other thing that I like to do is to do concealed lighting, so that it's not in the evening. It's not lights that you can see and that are bright, but they are hidden, and they're not, I wouldn't call them mood lighting, but they highlight something that you can't put your finger on. And I always love that little bit of something where you're not sure what it is that's made it special.
That mystery is so important.
Yeah. So so that's essentially, so with that, the aperture, I try to play on predominantly natural light, but an element of LEDs or artificial light that that can sort of change throughout the evening.
How do you feel about colour, and more particularly, is it your own personal interest towards more of the neutral schemes, or is that what your clients are into?
I have always had a similar style. It's evolved, but I wouldn't say that I have followed trends ever. I can look back at the work that I did in the 90s and I still love it today. I would not say that my work's trend orientated. I do like colour when it's appropriate and when it's used in the right situation, not just for the sake of colour. So if a client would say to me, I want a feature wall, I couldn't bring myself to do that. It has to be genuine and it has to be for a reason.
Yeah.
And it has to be integrated. So my natural tendency is a little more neutral. However, I would not say that in regards to furniture and artwork. So I like furniture and artwork to speak for themselves and to have their own personality. And so I like to bring colour in that way. And then if the room or a space calls for colour or calls for a feature, then I like to integrate it, but not just for the sake of colour.
The architecture for you is the background, it's the object, it's the vessel.
Yes. And also I think that a neutral palette, like I'm very much into landscape design as well, and landscape gardening. I love doing the landscapes in the projects that we do as well. It's very ambitious, but I do love doing it. And there's nothing like a picture window and the magnificent lush green of, say, a maple tree or an olive tree that's positioned in the right place. And then that will then dictate the palette for an interior.
I'm just imagining how all these holistic elements are tying together, and it's awesome. It's just really exciting to think about and hear that there's people that are on board and they're going for the holistic package, the holistic design experience, the landscape, the house, the garden, the interiors, the hardware, the lighting, the art curation. I imagine you're offering that service and support as well, and that are trusting you on that complete journey.
Well,
So often you see a whole team, right? There's a million different people involved, even if the budget's the same.
And you just said that word trust. And I think trust is a really important word, that if a client, you're only as good as your client, and you're only as good as the trust that your client has in you.
100%.
And regardless of the budget, if you've got a trusting relationship, you can achieve a design that everybody, is comfortable with at any budget. And I think that less is more, and that you don't need to throw, if you have a budget, you don't have to have everything. It's better just to focus on the important things, the touch points.
And do them really well.
And do them really well.
It's the other thing we talk about risks and mistakes at the beginning of this conversation, and how also with product design that there's very serious consequences, and that how important that trust is as well for your clients to know that you are an industrial designer as well. You have that really holistic product experience.
Yeah, and I take them on the journey, and they say, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" And I say, "I am as sure as anyone can be. I'm very honest, and confident with choices and decisions." And so, yeah, that's why clients, I suppose, do trust in me. And even if it's a retail client and I'm designing a store design, I still have a feeling towards what the product is that they're selling, and have an opinion on the product that they're selling, and make sure that it all integrates. So it's trust from residential to retail to commercial.
What's the biggest barrier to trust or risk to trust, or red flag almost in creative collaborations?
Probably when they make an assumption that they won't be able to afford something, that it's going to be too expensive, without going on the journey and understanding that there are always ways to pare back, that you go for the dream, you have it priced, and then you pare back from it. I think that's probably, and that there are always options to reduce budgets or to reduce, but I think that the thing that scares clients the most is that they always jump towards it's going to be too expensive. But there are always ways to cut back.
It's that classic accusation of over-designing.
Exactly. And I think that you don't have to, like I said to you before, less is more, and you don't have to have everything. You really need to focus on bang for your buck and where you're going to get the most joy out of the design.
Absolutely, and that's a skill of a good designer. Doing a lot with a little, or doing a lot with retaining the core idea, the big idea. As we often say on this program, architecture is about ideas. What's that one core thing or one core idea you need to hang on to when they cut your budget?
I think it's integration. So probably when they cut the budget, it's that what we take out doesn't impact the overall concept. Yes. And the overall intention. So the design intent can remain, and you can change the budget of materials, but I think so long as the design intent remains intact, that's the most important thing.
So if I understood this correct, you had the amazing experience of being able to come into interior design and architecture without working for an interiors practice.
I just sort of did it on my own.
I think that's really
myself, I suppose.
Important to highlight for listeners that not everybody's path is conventional. Not everyone has to go A plus B, do your time.
Definitely not. And when I was studying interior design was not like it is today.
Yes.
Today, everybody's an interior designer if they've got an Instagram page. But I think that it's important to have skill, first of all. But I do think that you can develop your own path and find your own path. I don't think that you have to do it the conventional way. And that's why I think today apprenticeships are so good. I am so for an apprenticeship. I wish there were more, because there's nothing like hands-on work and study and being able to evolve and do that while you're also studying, right? So I feel like my degree back then, industrial design, the way it was back then, where we had a lot of our classes in the TAFE college in Cardigan Street in Carlton, and we learnt how to weld. We had to do casting. We had to do all these manufacturing, bending, making models, bending materials. It was like an apprenticeship.
If you wanted to design it, you had to know how to make it.
Today you don't. Today you can study all these courses and never make a thing and never know how anything is made. And that's probably my biggest criticism of the courses today. They're too conceptual. I know they're all very conceptual, and sustainability is very important, and they're very sustainability driven and focused, and they're very conceptual in terms like in interior design. You have to design something that you're probably never going to make, but they don't know how to make things. So how can they possibly come get a job and be able to design if they don't know how to make? They can't draw technical drawings anymore.
They're expecting industry to teach them that.
You're right. And we had to do technical drawings, and then we had to make that object.
Learn some hard lessons in the process
Exactly.
if you didn't draw it right.
Yeah, and a lot of airbrushing. That's one thing I don't miss, the airbrushing at uni, because we didn't have computers, so we had to airbrush everything. So it was different, but we learnt how to make things. And I think that is probably the biggest takeaway for me in how courses have changed over the last 30 years.
Would you go straight to the interior design if you had a chance?
No, I wouldn't have. In fact, if I was starting again today, I would probably either do what I did, industrial design, or do engineering.
And then move into the design space.
And move into the design space from that. I think engineering is very practical.
That's really important advice that I'm hearing from you for the next generation of designers. Hang on to those skills. Find a way to learn those skills.
And I think that, I appreciate it. So when there's Melbourne Design Week and you go around and you have a look and you see what the furniture makers are making, I'm so impressed with the furniture makers, what they're making. And that is not necessarily a degree. A lot of them are self-taught, but they've taught themselves to make things, and they understand how hard it is, and they understand how expensive it is to make something, particularly in Australia. But they at least could then pick up a pen and they could draw how it's made and how it's put together. So that's the skill that I think is lacking at the moment. And I think that, the students are kind of missing out. And that's why I say it's good for them to, like I said at the very beginning, it's good for them to get work experience and unpaid work so that they're out in the industry and they're learning on the job.
What do you look for when you're curating art for the interior design?
With art, I love to have the story and for it to have a feeling and an emotion. I personally love impasto painting, which is very thick textured oil paints. And there are a few artists that I can think of that I really love their work because they have an emotional feeling towards them and a beautiful story. So I appreciate when there is a real story and a real feeling behind the artwork.
And is that often an isolated feeling that you're looking for, or it's one that will connect to the story and the design of the house or the project you're working on?
No, I think it's actually just the piece on its own, nothing to do with the house. I think it's important that art stands for itself and doesn't really have to match the house. Because if you love it, if a client loves it, if someone loves it and they have an emotional attachment, that's the most important thing. It's not whether I like it or whether, I think it's important that the story and the emotional attachment appeals to your client.
Have you had any really memorable aha moments with the client, or where they've just trusted you and they've run with it and it's been revealed at the end when you've handed over the project?
I have one client in particular that they said we want art. They were renovating their house. We're only now renovating it. It's in construction at the moment, 10 years later.
Wow.
So 10 years ago, I first was contacted by them and they wanted to look at art. And I said to them, art is not something you buy straight away. It's something that you collect over time. So now 10 years down the track, we've done a salon hang, which means a wall that has all different size paintings on it together in a salon hang. And now probably 10 years down the track, they can't believe how long it took, but how good it is. And they say it to me all the time that I kept saying, you've got to be patient. You've got to be patient. Art is not like walking into a supermarket and filling your fridge. It's something that takes time. The artist that has to produce the right kind of piece that you're attached to and that talks to you.
You have to fall in love with it.
Right. So yeah, so that's what's happened with them. And I mean, they love what they've got now, because I said to them, don't buy crap, buy work that we feel will go up a bit in value, that will hold its value, which is what we've done. Now they probably can't buy those artists, because what I tend to do is to look for young, unestablished artists that have potential, who I believe in, and I like to nurture the artists. So for a lot of my clients and for myself, we've bought from their first exhibition or their first show when they were kind of unknown, and now they've gone on to, much bigger and better things. And this client in particular says to me all the time, I can't believe we got that work and that artist has become so famous now. One has won the Archibald Prize this year. And so
that's trust, though. That's that trust in the process.
And that's why I say to them, we've got to find the right artist, because we want to nurture the right young up-and-comer.
Very much as a patron.
Yeah. So that's what I like to do, and that's what I like to encourage clients to do. But as I say, it requires patience and trust as well.
They're really key ingredients in design, because we often talk about on this program how long design takes, how long architecture takes, the timeline of a building, and that you're not just buying your house, you're not just getting that new reno upgrade, you're actually buying 3 to 4 years of our life, of that time spent in the relationship of worrying, stressing, designing, waking up in cold sweats at night thinking about the paint colours.
Exactly. So I actually have, funnily enough, 3 projects at the moment in construction, coincidentally. All 3 of them we started in 2014.
There we go.
Designing. Then then the client wasn't sure, then the client put it on hold, then we prioritised other things like art, then COVID came along. And so it's a journey, and it's a matter of accepting that you'll get there in time, but it's better for it to be quality over quantity, and that you're better off holding back until you really feel ready to do it.
I think that's a really important point for any practitioners that are tuning in tonight to this conversation or who will catch up and listen to us, because right now people are worried about the market and what is happening, about projects going on hold, not as many coming through. What is your advice to practitioners and other designers that are needing to find that fortitude to be patient?
It reminds me, funnily enough, of the 90s when no one could get a job in the 90s or early. It was actually 1990, and it was very difficult. And that's when you have to be prepared to pivot, take jobs that you're not necessarily, wanted. You might have to transition into another career for a while. But everything goes in cycles and moves in cycles, and you have to have trust in yourself and trust in the fact that if you pivot temporarily or you diversify or you try a different skill, that something will work for you and will click.
There's so much faith in the design process, isn't there?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it is harder at the moment, definitely. And there aren't as many jobs on, but this is when you need to upskill as well. So if a younger person can't get a job at the moment, this is a good, or not the job that they want, this is a really good time to go back and do a short course or upskill or do another degree, something. It's a great time to do that.
I know you're not focused on trends, and you don't go by any of those trends. Are certainly not instant trends. I wouldn't have thought. But where do you think we're moving to in terms of a broader design era at the moment?
Well, I think that people will pare back. They've become much more conscious, obviously, with the economy, cost of living. So people will pare back. And I think that people will appreciate things from the past and, things that your parents had or that your grandparents had, and like repurposing old things. I think that that's probably going to be a trend. And I also think that absolute essential necessity will become a really important part of design, whether it means, the materials that you use, whether it's a raw material and not powder coated, for example, or it's a raw wall and not a painted wall. So I think that necessity becomes part of invention, and I think that's what's going to start to happen. I hope it does, because I think that there's been many years of excess, a lot of excess and a lot of waste. So I'm hoping that it sort of pivots to essential materials and essential forms.
And a real purity and essence in that, and honesty of materials.
Yes.
Do you think also the scale of people's houses will inevitably, as a result of that, really start reducing to what people actually need?
100%, because I think that the scale takes away from, well, if you're spending your budget on the scale and not on the quality, so I think that the quality is more important than the scale. And I definitely think that there will be a movement to appreciating smaller, less, and what you need.
Here. It's what we actually really like to emphasize on this program, that the experience of living in a well-designed home, of living amongst, with, being in symbiosis almost with good design, is so much better.
Absolutely. I think that's probably the most important thing. I think that living with, also within your the environment, and appreciating the environment, appreciating the trees, appreciating the landscape, and that's what I always focus on as well.
Connecting to place, connecting to where you are.
Exactly.
What does good design mean to you?
Good design. What does it mean to me? I think it means, to me, good design is absolute, essential, pared back, deliberate design, not design for the sake of it, but design for what's essential. And I know it's really cliche to say form
follows function.
But and it's very cliche, but if you look at those case study houses, that's exactly what they are. So the way they were manufactured or the materials that were available at the time is what drove the design of those houses. So I think that it sort of became essential design. So I think that's what I think is good design.
Coming back to those core principles.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm mindful of the time. I'll ask our last question. That's what gives you hope?
Well, at the moment, probably appreciation and tolerance gives me hope. And I hope that people are more tolerant with everything in terms of design, that, like I said to you at the very beginning, when a staff member or somebody has a hiccup or a mistake, you've got to put it into the biggest picture and into perspective of life. And that's what I hope that people take away, that mistakes are made. People do the wrong thing. It is human error. But at the end of the day, you've got to move on and be mindful and tolerant and learn. And so I hope that people learn.
Perfect point. Perfect point to end on. Thank you so much for joining me on the program, Shareen.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another evening of Radio Architecture with Ilana Razbash. This live show was broadcast and recorded in the Radio Karim studio on Bunurong Country. You can replay this show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and supporting community radio. Take care.
Hey, I'm Jane Oakley, a Matilda alumni footballer, number 36, and you're listening to Radio Karim.